Hi, I'm Anisha Gupta, and I'm a co-founder at a company called Bluebird. I'll be talking to you today about substantiating sustainability and really how to walk the talk when you're talking about your product sustainability. Bluebird is a company that helps brands to make better products when it comes to sustainability and talk about that transparently with their consumers. And I know we probably have both some consumers, like all of us, and also brands in the room. So hoping that this is exciting and interesting for all of you. So we all know that sustainability is now table stakes, right? So brands know that it's incredibly important to consumers. Consumers are looking constantly for more sustainable products. It's just part of the conversation. But what a lot of people don't know is that sustainability is now key to both growth as well as loyalty for brands. So what we've seen and the data is showing that sustainability marketed products are now growing at almost a 3 times rate compared to conventional products. And 48% of new products now incorporate and market sustainability. And that's up from 36% in 2020. So that's a pretty huge jump in 2021. So you'll see that this is continuing to accelerate over time. In addition to that, you'll also see that sustainability is now becoming really key to loyalty. So consumers are now saying that sustainability is the thing that will make them most likely to shop with a brand again. And this is now for beauty specifically, even more important than discounts and free samples, meaning that consumers will come back to a brand if they have sustainable packaging or talk about their sustainability. And that's more likely to bring them back than free sampling and discounts, which are things that have largely been one of the biggest drivers for bringing customers back. But the issue with that is that as the growth of Gen Z continues to take over the market, we see that 88% of those consumers don't trust brand sustainability claims. And why is that? Beauty brands have largely been leaning on attributes. So things like, these words refillable or ocean-bound plastic, PCR, or zero waste, a bunch of these words, and it's getting really confusing. And a lot of consumers are wondering, what do these words even mean? And how does that relate to the product's impact? Beyond just the consumer side of things as well, we're seeing that there's actually a huge move towards regulation and legislation around greenwashing. So greenwashing being companies that use language to talk about product or their company's sustainability, but they may not be talking about things fully, authentically, and transparently. And that means that they might be misleading consumers on what their products are. So in both the UK and the EU, there's actually been regulation that has been coming out over the last couple of years. So in the EU specifically, they're finding that half of the green claims used to sell products in the EU are misleading. And there's actually going to be new rules coming out to further, prevent greenwashing in the EU. And in the UK, it's also similar. And there actually was a report that just came out this week that said that the Competition and Markets Authority, which is similar to the FTC here in the US, is going to specifically introduce new rules and examine accuracy of claims made around what they're calling toiletries, which includes beauty products. So it's getting more and more important for brands to look at this. But actually, it's not just Europe. So we have something called the Green Guides here in the US that were introduced in 2012. They were pretty lenient compared to some of the new rules that had been coming out in the EU and in the UK. But there was actually just a release saying that the FTC is now seeking public comment meaning that public can go in, including, brands and companies and consumers, can all go in and submit comments to allow them to update those rules. And they're expecting for those rules to include things like, making changes to how you can talk about carbon offsets and climate change, how you can talk about the term recyclable, how you can talk about, the term recycled content and compostable, degradable, sustainable. So all of these kind of buzzwords, those attribute-based statements that I had mentioned before, those are all becoming, a little bit, harder to use, even, just right now. But as these increased regulations come out, it's going to be critical. So really what we're seeing is that, the lack of trust from consumers and this increased regulation paired together means that brands need to substantiate their claims around environmental sustainability, specifically on a product level. Without that, brands are getting canceled. I'm sure many of you remember the controversy around skin, the Kim Kardashian line, where there was a refillable product, and there were, TikToks flying all over the place around, this isn't actually refillable, this is just greenwashing, you're essentially making, a toilet paper cover, or excuse me, a tissue paper cover that is not necessary to the function of the product and is just adding extraneous waste. And this is happening for brands for even smaller things and larger things as well, but this is just a pretty poignant example. Brands are also starting to get publicly sued or fined for violations. So this happened with Allbirds, H&M. There was also in the last few weeks, the greenwashing crackdown at Sephora as well. So this is becoming more and more common here. And ultimately what this is all doing is leaving a pretty terrible impact on the environment. So fast-moving consumer goods, which is, includes tons of different types of consumer goods, but also, beauty is a huge part of that, are one of the top 8 highest emitting supply chains globally. Those top 8 supply chains account for 50% of global emissions. So this is a huge, huge issue, and we're all aware of, the toll that climate change is taking on the earth. So this is also, been coming up in, the press recently. This report just came out by Carbon Trust, talking specifically about, clean beauty and sustainability being used as words loosely in beauty, and how that's then, making it really distracting from the actual impact of carbon emissions and how that then, relates to the true environmental impact of these products. What they found in this study is that really by using these types of claims, it's really, leading to really limited recognition and ownership over the impact that the beauty industry is perpetuating for climate change. So again, it's a really critical issue that, we all have a part to play in. And really, this comes down to, are we overlooking the biggest sustainability challenge within the beauty industry by using, this attribute-based language? Ultimately, we need to, show our homework and use science-based tools to tackle climate change. So that's leading to the fact that measurement is really the key to substantiation. Regulators already, so those UK and EU regulations that I talked about already require the use of what's called a life cycle assessment to make claims on environmental impact for products. Just to get to some definitions, because these are pretty scientific terms, a life cycle assessment is just a way to measure the environmental impact of a product, looking at all stages of it. And I'll go into, a concrete example of what this means for beauty. This can cover many different impact categories. So climate change and, carbon emissions being one of those, but there's also things around air quality or, water quality, biodiversity. So these are all different attributes that could be looked at within a life cycle assessment. But where we are largely focused, and where the industry has a lot of room to improve on, and it's helpful to have a single or a couple of areas of focus. So a product carbon footprint specifically looks at the carbon impact of a product. So looking at a life cycle assessment, but just looking at a single attribute around carbon emissions. I will say that waste is also a huge issue and needs to be paired along with the carbon impact. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be, really talking and digging deep on carbon. So when looking at what a life cycle assessment is, LCAs really need to look at the holistic impact of a product and ultimately document, those assumptions in their calculations, as well as they're making, assumptions, because data is not readily available in all cases. So for a product, you're looking at, just this hair mask here. You need to source your ingredients. So that could mean, producing them, with, chemicals that are extracted, or growing them, with agriculture. You then process them, transport them to a manufacturer. You then, also make that product into, make all those ingredients into a product. So you combine all those ingredients, you process that using, heat and, different, equipment that then uses electricity, and you fill it into the factory. For the packaging, similarly, you need to source all of the materials that go into it, process those, manufacture the different pieces of packaging. So here, the tube, the cap, and the carton, the box, all require different materials, and those need to be then formed into these different pieces. And then those pieces need to be transported to where the product is being manufactured. And then after the product is made, there continues to be impact. And ultimately that's rolled into the overall impact of the product as well. So that includes shipping and distributing the product to consumers via different transportation methods. Using the product is also a huge area of impact in consumer products. And with the water use that's required in many cases, and heating that water, and then disposal and end of life as well. And that has a lot to do with waste, but also, the actual, recycling or landfilling and the processes that go along with that. So where do the carbon emissions come from? So these can come from direct emissions from factories, emissions from transportation fuel, and emissions from electricity at a high level. And, those kind of pop up in all of these different areas. So we often focus on, packaging is what we think of when we think of sustainability. And that's the easiest place to go to, because, you're holding a product in your hands. But ultimately, there's so many different places along the journey of a product, its life cycle, where emissions are actually part of the picture. So ultimately, this means brands need to look at all aspects of a product to understand its impact, and not a single attribute. So why aren't brands doing this today? Historically, this can be incredibly expensive to do. For a single product, it can be, thousands of dollars. And for those of you that, produce beauty products, or you're going on a site, brands don't have just one product most of the time. They have, tens or hundreds of products in some cases. So this could be an incredibly expensive endeavor. These assessments also can take a ton of time. So when you're digging really deep into your supply chain, most of these brands don't own their own manufacturing, which is something that, you know, the consumers in the room might not know. A lot of brands, you know, you anticipate that these brands kind of own their own factories and are making all their own products, but it's actually more efficient and cost effective and just, you know, standard practice to, you know, outsource most of your manufacturing. And that means that collecting all of the data takes a really long time, and that makes it so that it can take 6 or 9 months to do one single product assessment, or, you know, your entire, you know, product catalog. And that is a really long time that brands who are trying to launch new products just don't have time to do. And finally, you know, there's lack of access to that information needed. So, you know, you're asking your vendors for this information, you know, the people that you're buying, you know, your different, you know, packaging from, your raw materials from, who are actually, you know, making the product and filling it and distributing it. And they may only have pieces of each of the equation to give you. And also internally, brands most of the time don't have sustainability talent and people who are experts. So that makes it really, really hard to know what questions to ask, how to get the right information, and how to then, you know, match that with how to actually assess impact. But given everything that we talked about around, you know, consumer trust and regulation, life cycle assessments are really the best way to substantiate sustainability. And technology is really making it easier to make these informed decisions and communicate them in a way that is really transparent. So the best practices that I'll try to boil down to 3 main steps are: look at designing products holistically from the start. So use data to inform your product development process versus, you know, developing a product and then going in and checking it at the end of your process. So a lot of the time brands will start and then get very confused on what can I actually say about this product after they've made it, and they'll find that there's not a whole lot they can talk about. The next bit is measuring how your product is doing and evaluating how to reduce that product's impact over time, and continuing to take action on that. And the third is communicating using data and sharing those results and assumptions in a very transparent and easy to access way. So around designing products holistically, again, you want to look beyond just the single product attributes like plastic free, because there's a lot that can go into it. So for example, if you're, you know, procuring a glass component, so a glass jar, and, you know, a lot of brands have really latched onto, we want to be plastic free, so we're going to use glass. But then they're shipping it in from Asia, and glass is much heavier than plastic. If you've ever felt, you know, a glass bottle versus a plastic one, they're significantly heavier, up to 3 times heavier in many cases. And a lot of times brands, you know, are using air shipping. So air shipping is about 19 times more intensive than shipping via a boat. So by, you know, eventually choosing a glass component, there's a huge carbon impact that has to do with that. Of course, there are implications when it comes to oceans and the health of our oceans and all of the plastic waste that ends up in the ocean. But again, looking at the picture holistically and making those trade-offs needs to be part of decision-making as you're designing your products. You want to measure how your products are doing over time by conducting these life cycle assessments on a regular basis, ideally annually, but again, given the tools that exist, this can be very expensive, and there are, you know, a lot of difficulties with doing that if you don't have access to, you know, the right people or resources on your team. And the best way actually to reduce the impact for a consumer brand of your impact is to evaluate it for each specific product. And finally, you want to communicate by relying on data over attributes for your claims, making substantiation, of those claims and communications easily accessible, and then clearly stating what your assumptions are and the method. So here's an example of a brand called Activist Skincare. They have these refill pouches that they then pair with these glass bottles as their way to reduce their impact. They've done a really good job of highlighting on their site, in their FAQ section, the trade-offs that they've made around waste and carbon emissions, what the data is and what the assumptions are that they're using. And really stating, ultimately that when they're making these claims, they've looked at each of these different pieces of the puzzle to then come to the conclusion during, developing the product, putting the product into market, and then ultimately, like when they launch it and communicate it, they've really carried through that authentic sustainability through measurement. Coco Kind is a company that's gotten a lot of press over the last couple of years in this area. They've done really a great job kind of highlighting, where there's nuance and the importance of bringing measurement into the picture when talking about, products and brand sustainability. They, for each of their products on their site, publish carbon emissions information that then, looks at each of the different parts of the picture that we talked about in their life cycle assessment, also comparing it to, what that means and is grounded in kind of comparisons that you can access in your daily life and understand how much is that in terms of emissions. And then also publishing publicly their methodology and what pieces go into their assessments. Reformation, though it's not a beauty brand, has also a really great way of highlighting their sustainability. So they publish it for every single product on their site for both carbon emissions and then water savings as well, given that's a really important area in fashion. They publish kind of their footprint on a quarterly basis, and they also publish their methodology around what is the footprint and what's included in it. Here's a brand called Experiment Beauty, and they have developed their products using tools. They actually use Bluebird, and they have been able to, from concepting their products all the way through to actually launching their products, really bring data into the picture. So at the beginning of the process, they look at the different options they have. They look at the trade-offs between carbon emissions and also waste, and root that in data, and then measure the actual impact of the product, and then ultimately communicate that out using both claims, which you can see here. You can see that they're very data backed, as well as through a widget that they have on their site. And I'll show you what this looks like in kind of a live demo now. So I'll talk you through an example for a company called for a company called DewSkin. So Dew came onto Bluebird's platform as well. They, at the beginning of developing a new product, wanted to evaluate each of the different scenarios that they're looking at with different packaging options they were considering from different manufacturers in different locations, and different formats as well. And they measured each of those concepts and ultimately arrived at what they wanted to produce. So once they landed on that, they then decided to highlight that information on their site. So they include that same widget that I talked about where there is a sustainability report. And then when you actually click into this, you can see the waste impact here. You click into the link, it opens up a page that's available to the public that includes clearly what the methodology is, and you can see it here, what's evaluated in the carbon footprint, But then also it lets you kind of see what is included in each of the parts of the product, how the product's impact is. So you can see that there's, packaging here, supply chain, impacts from distribution, and also formulation. They've put all of this available to the public. They're protecting their own, proprietary data around who their manufacturers are, what their volumes are, but they're making it really easy to see that they've done the hard work and they're able to defend it. And also they're showcasing what they're comparing to when they're making claims. So often, you'll see brands say, our product is more sustainable because we use, plastic free, or we use, recycled packaging, or we don't ship with air. But compared to what? And you need to, really contextualize what is, the baseline or the benchmark that you're comparing a product to. So they also do, they also incorporate that into their communication. So the key takeaways here, you want to design your products holistically. So again, looking just beyond a single attribute and trying to think about, what are all of the different pieces that fit in. You want to measure the impact as opposed to, just putting forward an attribute. And then you want to communicate with data. And that means, providing the substantiation through transparency. So providing access to the information upon what assumptions you're making and why, what comparisons you're making, and what you're comparing to as well, and making that information very easy to access. So ultimately, how do you know if a brand or a brand's products are sustainable? Have them show you, not tell you. And that's going to be, the future where we're seeing the industry go, especially as consumers continue to demand, more information and, move towards, needing more trust from brands. And we need, to react to, regulation that's coming out and, continuing to get more and more stringent. So thank you for your time. And I think we'll now be moving into questions.